you could not have proactively designed a process more attenuated to break an Australian energy and climate summing up podcast.
Yes. 3 different people in the past 2 days have said to me, so do you guys use AI to summarize the papers? And I've been every time that's entirely antithetical to the whole point of the podcast.
Yeah. Masochistic self-flagellation in the form of report reading.
Every time my eyes cross with exhaustion and reading more text, it's a triumph of the human spirit over the cold world of the machine.
This is There Is Too Much, your regular extra serve of us banging on about climate and energy. It is just past 4:30 p.m. on Thursday the 18th of September, and we're here today for some shoot-from-the-hip commentary on the hundreds of pages of documents that landed in our inboxes a little over 4 hours ago. This is the sort of loosey-goosey shoot-from-the-hip stuff that we usually save for our bonus content, only available to our super Summerupperers. However, given the the weighty topics we're covering today, Australia's new 2035 target and the avalanche of reports, plans, prognostications and modelling that has descended upon us, we're releasing it to the masses in the national interest. Aren't we civic-minded, gang?
Yeah, well, we agonised.
Well, you more than me. Yeah, I wanted to put it behind the paywall.
That's true, and I was the vessel of the people arguing strongly against that. So feel free to buy me a drink next time you see me.
The segment is called "There Is Too Much." That has never been truer than today.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is really true.
If you tot up everything, it is 718 pages of material out today.
Yep.
Or over 1,000 if you count the climate impact and adaptation work released at the start of the week. It's a lot.
Yep.
And, of course, we've read it all. We're here to digest it all on the spot. No.
That's right.
That is actually not the case. We have at best scanned executive summaries and flicked through tables. So this will be pretty hot off the presses, and we will return to various elements of this in coming episodes. But you mentioned the adaptation stuff, and I think we'll spend most of the time on the mitigation side of things. But geez Louise, that was some bracing stuff in terms of the adaptation plan and the National Climate Risk Assessment that landed on Monday.
Yeah.
Do either of you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think it's really great that these documents exist and are out in the world. And, in one sense, the climate risk assessment is a really robust document. It's the work of Australia's best scientists. I think it's probably fair to say that there's not a lot new, I think, in the thrust of what this is saying, but in I guess the context in which it's been released, it's really kind of finally, I think, putting Australia's response to what we've known to be, the future if we don't take ambitious action, much more front and centre, and it's about time. But I would also just, I think having a lot of conversations with people I work with, people who are friends and care deeply about this, it is really confronting material to engage with. And, I think you do read it first as a human. And so I think it's only appropriate that we, kind of shout out to people listening today. Would like to say I hope everyone's feeling okay, having absorbed that material, and if nothing else, it is a really salient reminder of the why we're all doing what we're doing, and it couldn't have more purposefully set the stage for, today's release of the 2035 target and the things that we need to do to avoid the worst impacts of the picture that painted. So, yeah, I think all three of us have been very mindful, I think, about reading that with care and caution. And, I'm just sort of extending that care and well-being check-in with our broader listenership today.
Yeah, it's a lovely sentiment. I described the risk assessment as the ghost of climate future earlier this week, and the moral of that modern fairy tale is that you get that insight into how the future will play out if we continue on our current trajectory, and that gives us the opportunity to make different choices. And so that's the whole point, right? And that is what makes the material on the mitigation side of the ledger land so poignantly today, because this is the bare bones of a plan for how we make sure some of those worst impacts don't come to pass. And
I think it's important to say as well, the National Adaptation Plan is also a starting point.
Yes.
And I would say if we think there's a lot of work to do on the mitigation side of things, my goodness, we are really very much at the starting point of our adaptation journey as a nation. And so, I think it's good that it's out there, but I'd also say, it's a little light on firm commitments about exactly what the government will do. There's lots of really good suggestions about potential next steps, but we really do need to see plans for firmer action. And there was no funding announcements attached to the release of that document. So, I think, again, this is the start of us getting a much more sophisticated and granular understanding of what we need to do as a country across the different systems that report, the risk assessment identifies. But we've got a huge mountain to climb there too.
And absolutely agree with that. On the risk assessment side of it, some of the gaps and areas for future work that are identified in the report itself are sobering. The full dynamic response of the Australian economy to these impacts is poorly understood, and current modelling methodologies are likely to significantly underestimate the economic impacts. Global climate risks and opportunities, for instance, the impacts of climate change on our region, on our neighbours, need a much better understanding, including how they will flow through to Australian risks and challenges, and the effectiveness of adaptation action in response is not that well understood yet, or for that matter, the impact on altering the effectiveness of mitigation actions. How much of the land sink is going to be available to us with higher temperatures and drying of parts of the country. So it's version 1.0 across the board, and returning regularly to those questions is going to be really important. Currently, there's no rule that says this has to be done regularly, and there ought to be.
Couldn't agree more on that point, Janet. And I expect that's the first of a few times we might be talking about that in the next little while.
Yeah, and there are flags in the report that, like, the governance around the this policy area, including the independent analysis and reviews, like that is something that they're working on and that they'll circle back to in the next few months. So we'll watch that important agenda with interest. However, we could spend an hour just talking about adaptation, but there is more to talk about. And today, around 12 o'clock, the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and the Energy and Climate Minister jumped up and they did a bunch of things. They announced Australia's 2035 emissions reduction target. a pretty big range, 62 to 70% below 2005 levels by 2035. They also released a number of new documents. We've got a new overarching net zero plan. We've got the long-awaited 6 sectoral decarbonisation plans. We have the advice from the CCA that dropped around the same time. And we have all these documents scattered across about 13 different government websites. Mm-hmm. And I want to give a big shout out to the staffer in Minister Bowen's office that collected all the links and sent them to advocates so that we didn't waste the last 4 hours.
Joined up government at its finest.
There was did you not go to the landing page? There's a net zero landing page that links out to all that stuff. So
I didn't have to because it was emailed. This amazing email was sent to me.
Well, they're very helpfully for those who don't have direct lines into ministerial offices. There was a landing page on all this stuff, and you missed. There's a couple of things that you skipped there in your list. There's Treasury modelling that goes through the 3 different scenarios looked at, and I think we've agreed that might be our next deep dive topic conversation together on the pod.
Including the technical appendix?
Which Tennant is clearly very excited about. And the one that I went on a little mission to find because there was sort of a reference to the NDC, so the formal submission to the UNFCCC that Australia makes on that landing page and in the comms, but the link to that wasn't actually on the landing page directly to the document, so I went and found that and had a gander at that too.
So where should we start? I mean, the obvious place to start is reaction to the 2035 target.
We've eaten our adaptation vegetables and it's time for a heaping bowl of target sugar.
Oh, God. I don't like that characterization, but I'm going to let you roll with it, Reed. Yeah.
Well, what is the target?
The target, as I said earlier, is 62 to 70% below 2005 levels by 2035, which is a pretty big range and honestly bigger than I was expecting. We've had a range in the past. The Abbott government set a 26 to 28% target, which is a pretty narrow range. That's, 3 points of difference. This is 8. And I'm interested in both of your reflections on, the level of guidance that such a big range gives to policymakers at the state and federal level, gives to businesses that are considering kind of like what their decarbonisation trajectory and what their role in the transition could be. Like how much clarity does this provide around the trajectory we're on, not off at some esoteric point in the future, but literally, 10 years from now.
All right. Well, so 8 points is a substantial range. And I expect that over the course of the next 10 years, or for that matter, the next few months, we'll see a lot of argument about which end of that range is, quote unquote, the real target. Are we pitching things towards 70 and accepting that we might fall short? Or are we pitching things towards 62 and crossing our fingers and hoping that a gust of wind from behind lifts us up? Or is it a little bit of both? Or what? And is it the same interpretation that's taken across different portfolios, given that action towards this will need to be much broader than what the policy making that we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years. Like as of today, you can't say both ends are the range. I think the government will have taken a bit of comfort, maybe seen the absolute outer limits of what they felt that they could do in terms of bridging difference of view between the cautious and the ambitious. by looking at Brazil's 2035 NDC, which is also an 8-point range, 59 to 67% below 2005 levels. The smaller Abbott era range, like there wasn't a lot of science behind, or Australian science behind that range. That was, let's come up with a number that sounds sort of like the American number, given that the Americans are putting us under so much pressure to have a number. And their number, resulting from God knows what modelling shenanigans and internal political compromises, was 26 to 28% below 2005 by 2025. So it was a sound-alike.
So perhaps not a lot of science behind that exercise. We should be clear, the government has accepted the Climate Change Authority's advice, which was that this target range should be set. Yep. And I haven't actually dug in to the CCA's advice. One of the features of Climate Palooza or Climate Christmas or whatever we're calling it this week is that the advice was released simultaneously with the government's decision and the associated policy documents. So I just haven't got to it. But have either of you looked at the CCA advice and what they've said in terms of justification for that range?
I have heroically started the looking process.
I wanted to make another point here and kind of remind us on why we're getting a 2035 target right now. This is part of Australia's commitment to the Paris Agreement. We've submitted this target as our nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC. This is going into a bit of a synthesis process that the UN will do that will, I guess, sort of look at the collective ambition of the next round of NDCs across the world. And I think it's worth, in the context of, Tennant's comments about where the debate's going to go in the next few months, is remind everyone that the purpose of NDCs and the requirement on countries is to put forward their maximum ambition, right? And one of the things that was interesting to be reminded of in scanning through the NDC is that to be consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway in IPCC's work, you require, I think it's a 60% emissions reduction on 2019 levels by 2035. And that translates to a 68% reduction on 2005 levels for Australia's context by 2035. So really, what is interesting about that is how Australia rolls into this next round of global climate diplomacy, where the last couple of years, Australia have been very strong proponents in the discussions around mitigation ambition, around keeping 1.5 degrees alive, actually being very prominent and vocal on that side, and being the sort of the lead negotiating voice for the umbrella group of countries. Which is interesting now with the US obviously not involved. So I do wonder to what extent this target range will influence, I guess, the way Australia puts itself forward, in that context. I guess I would argue that 68% is within the range that we've put forward. But I do think there's a bit of a lightning rod there about where we need to be pitching policy development efforts to be able to be claiming that we're pursuing that we're being genuine about pursuing efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. I think that's an interesting nuance I hadn't, kind of seen picked up elsewhere in their documents.
So I guess my thought on this is one of the reasons why I was very comfortable aligning the EEC with the effort to lock in a 75% target was one of the reasons one seeks to be ambitious in this space is because you shoot for a high number, and then if you fall short, maybe you're in the low 70s or maybe you're in the high 60s. My concern, I guess, about this significant range is that if enough of government orients around that lower range as being good enough and what we're solving for, and this has a normative influence not just within the federal government but also at the state government level and for corporates and the like, we shoot for that and we end up in the low 60s or the high 50s or worse. So I'm still processing the range, honestly. I would have preferred a much narrower range that was a real number that we were all working with. It feels a little bit fuzzy, and I was already pretty tight about all the conversation around target speculation. I feel like the debate that you referenced, Tennant, that will roll on about which number is the real number just means that we're going to be in this cycle for some time to come as various parties argue for ambition within the range or say, no, 62% is what we should be shooting for. And, it's just not particularly productive.
Well, take a moment, take a breather, get your vim back, because that's the argument we're going to have.
Yes. I do think there's something to be said, and it was interesting listening to the Treasurer's comments, and he was really, emphasising, in his view, this provides certainty to investors and on the direction of travel, but it is a pretty wide target, and so I think the reason it still feels fuzzy to me as well is because there's not, there were, maybe we can touch on this, there were funding announcements that came alongside the release of all those documents that we've listed off, but not a huge amount of new policy. And so it's kind of hard to judge where you've got sort of BAU policy settings, which aren't enough to get us to either of those ends of the range.
They take us to 51.
Currently. Yeah. So, there's going to need to be a pretty significant bit of heavy lifting to ramp up the ambition of policies that we've already got. We might touch on those, but we are going to have to introduce new policies. And so it's kind of hard to judge at this stage, mere hours after the announcement, where some of that is likely to take us, because we're going to need new policy development anyway. And so, I guess that's my roundabout way of coming to the same conclusion as Tennant, which is we're all going to be in a bunch of conversations around policy reform off the back of this. And the argument will be how hard you push on each of the different levers. And in some ways, it's a nicer conversation than should we have those policies in the first place. That feels like, a little bit of a bridge that we've crossed here with the provision of sector plans, and now, I think, and clear understanding for the first time that we're actually going to have to do shit across more of the economy.
Don't worry, Frankie, those debates are still going on. They're just happening in a parallel universe. But we'll leave that universe to itself.
That's right.
For at least this episode.
Yep.
If there is too much.
Yeah, that's good call.
A couple of extra thoughts here. So we shouldn't underestimate, and the CCA recommendations note this, just the level of effort that will be involved in trying to achieve even the weaker end of the targets. So 62% is a 19 percentage point improvement in 5 years from the current 2030 target that the government is trying very hard to achieve and thinks will be achieved, but it might not be quite achieved on time. And that is going as hard in the electricity sector specifically to 2030 as almost anybody thinks can be done. And then maintaining that effort and then broadening that effort to a lot more emissions reductions in industry, in resources, in transport, the light vehicle standards that were legislated last year make barely any difference to our emissions in 2030 because of the slow turnover of the fleet, but they are a significant thing by 2035. But we're going to need to do a lot more in heavy transport. And so there's just going to need to be a lot here. I think the target is like the top end is real, and it is significant. But a thing that, of course, people were going to argue about anyway is fossil fuel exports and of course, a lot of arguments about the overseas emissions produced by those exports. But the production of the coal and the gas within Australia accounts for a significant chunk of our domestic emissions. One of the things,
a huge chunk,
as we were saying last episode, one of the things that makes a significant difference between a high end and a really high end target is without the Australian government's fingerprints being on the corpse, does the demand for Australia's fossil exports decline, and how fast? And does that give, alongside a bunch of regional and tax system and other headaches, does that give some wind in the sails of the decarbonisation effort here by a few percentage points? And I think that's probably one of the major things that would make a difference between the 62 and the 70.
So I think that's right. And the argument for the range is the huge swing factors that we have no control over in terms of global ambition on decarbonisation, both in our region and the influence of actors like the US. Like, there's just a huge amount of uncertainty. Like, we've waxed lyrical on both the positive and the negative side of that over the last year in terms of the opportunity for China to step up and play a leadership role versus the US just running around and wrecking stuff for the foreseeable future. And depending on how a bunch of those dynamics play out, it does have a really material effect on our ability to decarbonise here in Australia, not just because of the fossil fuel export element that you outlined, Tennant, which is real and material, but also just, as we know, the cost of decarbonisation, the availability of products and services that allow us to do that is driven by deployment, and the less deployment there is around the world, the higher those costs will be here in Australia, and that has an impact on our ability to do stuff at home as well. So, look, I'm not super critical of the range, but I do think that it raises challenges for people that are trying to solve for a particular future to have it as big as it is. The other thing I wanted to say before we move on is that the ability to achieve the higher end of the 2035 target will not be resolved between 2030 and 2035. It'll be resolved between the 18th of September 2025 and 2030. Because we will need to ramp up our ability to deploy a whole bunch of technologies and engage with a whole bunch of sectors and build momentum in terms of their emissions reduction journey that will allow that effort to really scale up in the back half of this coming decade. That is worth doing in the interest of meeting or beating our 2030 target, and also sets us up for 2035. So the degree that any of us within government and beyond government have an interest in the higher end of that range and even beating that range, we really need to focus on what we're doing over the next year, 2, 3, 4 years to set ourselves up to go like gangbusters in the 2030s.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And there were a couple of really good announcements in what came out today in terms of modest but necessary funding support to start some of that work. I did just want to reflect, having skimmed through the resources sector plan before we got too far off that point. I don't think expectation had been created that it would deal with exports or sort of the scope 3 of it all, and how how I guess those emissions projections are expected to change over time, but it doesn't do that. It does kind of call out the IEA's analysis previously that between 2025 and 2050, they talk about the global demand for coal to decrease by 71%, LNG by 40%, and oil by 42%. But it doesn't seek to translate those figures in an Australian context for the purpose of this work, as far as I can tell. But there might be stuff in the Treasury modelling.
So there is some stuff in the Treasury modelling, and we will, all things going well, talk a lot more about the Treasury modelling in due course, and won't that be fun? But there is a table in there, table 4.1, giving change in output for selected sectors across the three different policy scenarios that Treasury considered from 2025 to 2035 and to 2050. And in their baseline scenario, which is one where the world acts consistent with a well below 2 degrees global outcome, not a 1.5, but well below 2, and where Australia adopts a 65% 2035 target, so higher than the low end but lower than the high end of what's been adopted. The coal sector contracts in terms of the value of its output by 47% from 2025 to 2035 and by 72% to 2050. And gas and LNG contracts 27% to 35 and 67% to 2050. And there's a little variation across the other scenarios where there's more demand for renewable exports, or where Australia takes a breather from climate action for 10 years and then wakes up and goes, holy shit, we need to do something in a disorderly way. There's variations there, but most of that contraction is not reflecting Australian policy in the modelling. It's global changes. And so that's quite big.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it'll be good to dive into that in a little more detail for sure.
Should we spend a bit of time on the net zero plan, because it is the document that ties everything together. I want to give a shout out to the public servant who is clearly kind of like just done with it all and must have spent an enjoyable couple of hours coming up with a backronym.
An acrostic.
The clean? The clean of it all?
The clean. CLEAN. The C is for clean electricity across the economy. The L is for lowering emissions by electrification and efficiency. You're just sort of cheating there, but okay. The E is for expanding clean fuel use. The A is for accelerating new technologies, and for the N, we've got net carbon removals scale up. Which are fairly tortured ways of getting to your clean, but good on you. A for effort, I reckon.
That looks like a ChatGPT effort, if ever I've seen one. I would love anyone familiar and intimate with the process to tell me on the deal if that's true.
But we do have these 5 priorities, which broadly are clean energy, electrification and efficiency, clean fuel use, which is low carbon liquid fuels, more or less, I think we can say.
Oh, and there was money announced for that, one of the bigger chunks of change alongside this announcement.
Yep.
1.1 billion, details TBC, but it does look like it's in the form of a production credit. So that said, airlines and there are quite a lot of sectors lining up for that. So anyway, sidebar, sorry.
And then priority 4, accelerating new technologies. It's sort of a grab bag, but broadly in the space of industrial decarbonisation, but not exclusively so. And then, interestingly, priority 5, net carbon removals scaled up, which is all about CDR, which we've talked a little bit about on this podcast in the past, and has been an abiding interest of the CCA around, what Australia's policy in this space. That last one, priority 5, probably the most threadbare in terms of actual initiatives. But in some ways, understandably so, that is a relatively new area of interest for the government. What did you two make of those 5 priorities? Are they about right?
So they give a frame in which you can shoehorn most of the stuff that needs to be done. And at a first glance across the sector plans, there's a version of those 5 priorities reflected in each of them, and in a meaningful organising action kind of way. And you've got to love a good bad acronym.
I don't mind it. We've all been running on Afterburner this week, and that just elicited a chuckle from me.
Yeah, indeed.
I do want to spend a moment talking about the support for more of a focus on energy performance and electrification through this.
No arguments here, Frankie.
I figured, since you've been up to your neck in it as well. Really great to see, as I said, I think it's relatively modest compared to the, 5 billion kind of ring fencing from NRF for a net zero fund and the $1 billion for low carbon liquid fuels.
Although I would say on the NRF, as I understand it, that is existing funds.
It is.
That
it's
have
just
been allocated
reappropriated
to this effort.
Yeah.
And I, was interested in production tax credits as the next person, but it is kind of like theoretical money that shows up if the stuff happens. And so it has, I think, a different status to stuff that's hitting the forwards in the next 4 years.
Well, I think that's fair to a point, but there's quite a lot of corporate interest in low carbon liquid. My observation would be the demand for that is far more real and tangible than some of the other things that have production credits attached to them under Future Made in Australia, which is, look a little bit further off.
Yeah, and there's a difference between the specific $2 a kilo tax credit for hydrogen, which is completely at the mercy of the combination of demand and where technology cost reductions get that option over the period when that tax credit's in force, versus a production-linked incentive where there's a dollar envelope for how much has been committed, and the rate of support for the product will be whatever it needs to be to get things going in that context and with whatever level of competition there is. We know that the low carbon liquid fuels ain't going to be cheap. And see a few episodes ago for more of us complaining about the expensiveness of low carbon liquid fuels. But if you want to get something going, then this will, very plausibly, particularly given, as Frankie said, there are some large some airlines and some large freight businesses who they don't have an infinite willingness to pay, or there wouldn't be this issue. But we're very likely to get something going. You're just going to need to follow up this $1.1 billion with something a great deal more expensive to somebody.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, we've taken the scenic route to the point that you actually wanted to make, Frankie, which was about some welcome energy performance investments.
Yes, they deserve their moment in the sun because it's been a long time coming. And I think the starting point for this reflection, I think, has been, I know a lot of chats the three of us have had with various folks exposed to the work that Treasury's been doing over the last little while on their modelling exercise, looking for those abatement pathways across the economy. And, this sort of realisation, whatever you call it, that we are going to have to focus more on the demand side and energy efficiency and electrification if we are going to meet a target, of any credible ambition in a way that's that can be done as fast as possible, but also there is that kind of least cost. A lot of the stuff that we talk about when we think about energy efficiency and electrification stacks up economically. The technology is there. There are so many co-benefits, like it's just no-brainer territory all around. But we've lacked some of the kind of policy foundations and frameworks to really put a rocket under things that need to happen at scale. And your point earlier, Luke, about being able to start ramping up the deployment of these things so that they're really delivering at scale, in the 2030s. And that's sort of the job ahead of us over the next few years. So there was $85 million put aside, and a couple of things very close to my heart in this list as well. There's money for the rollout of NATRs for existing homes. That's home energy rating for those of you who don't speak buildings acronym. And that's really going to underpin, hopefully, a nationwide effort to get home energy retrofits going and move towards, a situation where we can do disclosure of those ratings at the point of sale and lease. So super exciting. Should have happened 10 years ago. The next best time is now. Money for the Neighbours program, which, as we've talked about lots of times before, benchmarks energy performance of commercial buildings, and it does a lot of other things, but I think that's the salient one here. Expansion of the commercial buildings program, expansion of the GEMS program, which, of all the kind of government programs out there, it kind of gets maybe like some of the far less attention, I think, than it merits, because that's a program that governs the efficiency and the kind of emissions profile of all the appliances that people buy and the energy rating labels that are attached to them. And the last one I am going to leave to you, Luke, because I know that's been a little project close to your heart.
Passion project. Co-sign all of the above. Just really important investments. Like, as you say, quite modest, but really strategic investments in long-standing programs that we need to scale up to do a power of work particularly in the next decade, but certainly beyond. But yes, after the Prime Minister stepped down at the press conference, Minister Bowen stepped up, and one of the things that he highlighted was that he would be tasking AEMO with creating a demand-side statement of opportunities.
The DSU.
The DSU.
The long-mooted, long advocated for DSU. And look, the rationale for this is pretty straightforward to lay out. We have an ESU, an electricity statement of opportunities, a GSU, a gas statement of opportunities, and those two documents provide guidance to investors about where they should be focusing their attention over the coming period. But there's no equivalent effort on the demand side, and so there isn't the granular analysis or the actionable recommendations for ministers around, the sorts of policies or programs or interventions or regulatory reforms that we should be pursuing to unlock the opportunity on the demand side. And so what a DSU should do is balance that information architecture, if I can put it that way, so that ministers can consider opportunities on the supply side, opportunities on the demand side, and make decisions on that basis. And we can get to a point that we always should have been at, which is co-optimising across the supply side and the demand side. So the DSU useful in and of itself, but should also support much more sophisticated documents like an upgraded integrated system plan that we can look forward to in the future. So this is super wonky. It's super exciting. Yeah. And I look forward to summing up a DSU on an upcoming episode of Let Me Sum Up.
Alongside its benefits for the Australian energy systems, its most important outcome, content generation for this here podcast.
Because we're clearly lacking in that at the moment, right?
I reckon there's a decent chance that by the time we finish summing up all of the documents coming out of this very week, we could actually have a decent
See you next year.
See you next year. It's good stuff and provides, I think you used the word foundation, Frankie. I think that's right. I think it provides a strong foundation. There's more to do, but this is something that I've described in a few places as table stakes. This shows credibility and seriousness on the energy performance agenda and is a bloody good start.
And it was funny. I went digging through the actual NDC document that was submitted to the UNFCCC, and for those who are interested in it, I'm sure we'll post links to all the things maybe in the show notes, or maybe we won't. You can go find it for yourselves on the Net Zero landing page. But there's a couple of annexes to the document, and Annex B is Australia's response to the global stocktake, which is, I found, like the most interesting part of it by far. The rest of it there's like a 20-page glossy up front, but because there are like prescribed clauses that governments need to respond to in terms of the GST, and just reflecting on that, I know I was talking to the lovely David Higgins from DQ a few days ago, when he was asking for picture updates of little baby Muscovich, my little one that came with me to COP in Dubai. I was just sort of saying, at the time, I certainly wasn't thinking that COP would be reflected on as particularly ambitious. But I think with a little bit of hindsight and the experience of a Baku COP, I think the language around fossil fuel phase out, it took 28 COPs to get there on that. And, the triple-double, has really resonated and I think is driving activity. And so, anyway, just looking at the response to some of that, it's just as well they've started to do stuff on this and put those foundations in place, because they wax lyrical about the tripling renewable capacity and then have much less good to say when it comes to doubling efficiency gains. So it's so good that's right up there with renewables, because as you've said, Luke, they're two sides of the same coin, and we need to be looking at demand on par with supply. And hopefully the next time we need to respond to a GST, we're going to have a lot more interesting and good gains to talk about, because there weren't many this time.
So we don't normally do one more things on our bonus episodes, but I reckon that's what we have time for. One more thing that has captivated your attention from the cavalcade of documents that was released by the government this week. Tennant, what have you got?
I'm gonna surprise you.
By which you mean you're not.
Is it the absence of a certain four-syllabled?
Well, it's not entirely absent, but dear listeners,
okay.
Today's announcements do not resolve the issues around the carbon leakage review and the preferred solution to it. What is said on the topic of carbon leakage is that the carbon leakage review final report will be coming out soon. It's not part of today's drop, which means it will get the opportunity to get a lot more loving individual attention from all of you. But the major recommendations of that review are referenced. One of them is the adoption of a border carbon adjustment in Australia, and the government says the Australian government will release the report from the review to continue discussions on its recommendations with impacted industries, and will give further consideration to the issues and whether to implement a BCA in the 2026-27 review of the safeguard mechanism. That's all very well. To me, that bespeaks a little nervousness about a complex reform, one that impacts on trade at a time when there's a bunch of weirdness emanating from the US, but also high sensitivity of the US to anybody else doing anything in trade that they consider weird.
So, Tennant, I reckon last time we spoke about this, you were of the view that it would make a lot more sense to square away the broad direction of travel on the CBAM before getting into the safeguard mechanism review.
I still think that.
And this is a fairly clear indication that the government intends not to do that.
Yeah, and so the implication of that is, I mean, there's room for some parallel discussions here, but the implication of that is that the safeguard review, more even than it looked like before, is like a 10-dimensional chess game in which you need to think about the implications for every component of the decisions that are in principle open for consideration on every other component, like what you would do on decline rates, on TIBA, on access to ACCUs, on government revenue or not. All of those things look different if a border adjustment, or they could, there's room for them to look different if there is a border adjustment versus not. And so I guess that's just going to be a really exciting, stimulating, intellectually productive review. And if it isn't those things, then it will be leaving a lot of potential value on the table.
It's one to watch. I tend to agree with you. Having that variable solved for, at least to some degree, would clarify some of the other elements and could make it more straightforward to come to a resolution on the glide path, in particular post 2030. But all right, well, we'll watch that space. Frankie, what about you? What's your one more thing?
Oof. Well,
choose your doom.
Can I have two? But I'll make it really quick. I promise.
I mean, you're the one that said you wanted to finish in 2 minutes, so
that's true. All right. I took a little peek at the building sector plan, my first love, and
are you gazing longingly from IGCC towers?
Not at all. But it was the last 9 years of my life, so sure. I had a more than passing interest in where some of that stuff landed.
Yep.
I think then, my earlier comments about a hell of a lot more work needed to do the doing of efficiency and electrification is very obvious from looking at the sector plan, because, whilst advocates in that sectors, would say buildings can decarbonise most of their Scope 1 and Scope 2 today, the technology's there. The sector plan doesn't suggest that that's the case on 2050, that there's actually quite a bit of residual gas use in buildings, both residential and commercial, with commercial being a bit more of a laggard. So I think that just sort of points to this is sort of some of the stuff we're notionally calling lower hanging fruit, and will need to be offset, kind of elsewhere in the economy. If we're getting to net zero by 2050, then, I think we need to be looking much more closely at policies that will drive electrification, not just incentivise it. So that was my first one. And the last one, very quickly, just a comment, and I'm sure we'll get stuck into it our next episode, around some of the Treasury figures on the potential value of green exports if we go down the route of more of the upside scenario, which is, sort of really looking to leverage our advantage, and they put the total value of our green exports, that includes green ammonia, green iron, alumina, aluminium, and critical minerals, could get to 80 to 93 billion in 2035, and then up to 178 billion in 2050. But they also give a range. It's 109 to 178 billion, which are huge numbers, and, reason to kind of roll out of bed and do something about it. But those are big ranges, and that ain't going to happen on current policies either. So really interested to dive into the Treasury modelling to see kind of what's informed that, and I guess sort of what the policy asks are going to need to be from here on out, because it almost certainly we're going to need more that's currently in the Future Made in Australia agenda.
I am going to riff on your first point, Frankie, for my one more thing, and sort of circle back to the adaptation of it all, which is that in a environment that is incredibly constrained in terms of bandwidth, and also constrained in terms of available kind of, capacity in the market to do things, both in terms of investment and skills, finding those win-wins where you get an adaptation outcome and a mitigation outcome is incredibly important. And there's lots of opportunities for that in the building space in particular, things like thermal performance in homes, accelerate up the priority list even more than they were already when you take into account the benefits in terms of energy system decarbonisation and the resilience benefits that can accrue to households across the country by insulating them literally from those extreme weather events. So I think that one of the things we need to do is bring these two parallel conversations together. The Venn diagram doesn't completely cross over. There are some specific things on adaptation that really need a power of work that don't have a lot to do with mitigation and just, are about cushioning us from the impacts of climate change, but there is a lot that does cross over, and thinking about those things in an integrated way will make it more likely that we make progress on both fronts.
Hear, hear.
All right, that is our bonus content.
You were going to say rapid, but that implies brief in a sense.
I was going, quick fire, snappy. Not really. There is so much more we could say. We will continue to say it. In fact, I am here to announce that we have done some forward programming for our exclusive subscriber-only bonus episode for from here to Christmas, perhaps. Tennant, would you like to reveal what we will be covering on our fortnightly bonus episodes over the coming weeks?
In a special limited series of bonus content, LMSU takes on the entire Australian economy, one sector at a time. No sector shall be spared our friendly interest as we do each of the sector plans. We haven't decided which of the sector plans will go first.
Oh, it's got to be energy. It's got to be energy,
yes,
right?
Yes, it does have to be energy.
That's the sector plan to rule them all.
It's the biggest one.
So, what I can reveal is that next week on Let Me Sum Up, we will dig deep into the Treasury modelling, and the bonus episode will be on the energy and electricity sector plan. And in each subsequent week, we will do another sector plan as our bonus episode, possibly with a short interregnum, as all three of us, I believe, are going to COP, right? And so we might need to take a beat if we haven't got through all of the sector plans by then. But we will get them all done. That is our commitment to you. You will not break us, Bowen. It will all be summed up.
It will all be summed up. But we did say this is bonus content. So, we've dropped the paywall for today, as Luke said, in the national interest, despite my best efforts to extort you all and get you over to support us on Patreon.
The first test's for free.
That's right.
But if you want continued access to sectoral plan content,
run. Don't walk to letmesumup.net. You can find support LMSU at the top of the page. You will find our Patreon through that route. And for the low price of $10 a month or $100 a year, you can access all of that sweet boko. All right, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening, gang. Thanks in particular to our Super Summerupperers that support us week in and week out. We'll talk to you again soon.